Fowler begins in infancy to age 3 with what he calls undifferentiated faith. He refers to the undifferentiated phase of infancy as a pre-stage that precedes his subsequent 6 stages of faith. It's during this time of a child's life when they have their first experiences of mutuality, that is, the sharing of feeling, action, or relationship between them and their caregivers. Fowler states, and I quote, "Our first pre-images of God have their origins here. Particularly, they are composed from our first experiences of mutuality, in which we form the rudimentary awareness of self as separate from and dependent upon the immensely powerful others." End quote. Again, Fowler's definition of faith involves values from which we draw strength when faced with threats from more powerful forces in our world. Thus, during the undifferentiated pre-stage, and I quote, "the seeds of trust, courage, hope, and love are fused in an undifferentiated way, and contend with sensed threats of abandonment, inconsistencies, and deprivations in an infant's environment." End quote. He goes on to say that the emergent strength of faith in this stage is the fund of basic trust and the relational experience of mutuality with the ones providing primary love and care. Even in unfortunate circumstances where such care is not provided, the faith system can still find its roots, but yield value systems based on isolation and lack of trust, as is the case in the self-sufficient and exploitative values of adult narcissism. Let's move on to stage 1, intuitive projective faith, ages 2 to 6. Based on the research from the developmental psychologists, Fowler reiterates that a child of this age, and I quote, "uses the new tools of speech and symbolic representation to organize her or his sensory experience into meaning units." End quote. The child begins to use imagination to bring sense to the language, symbols, actions, moods, and stories of the adults in their lives. They're not inhibited by logical thought at this time, and therefore create elaborate fantasies based on the stories that they hear from others. This is the sort of storybooking ideals of fairy tales. Fowler modestly includes biblical stories among these fairy tales, as is warranted, given the way they're presented in Christian children's storybooks at this age. The imaginative stories that the child develops can have long-lasting emotional reinforcers. Fowler says that these emotional reinforcers will have to be sorted out by later, more stable and self-reflective valuing and thinking. At this point, Fowler also boldly calls out a danger that exists at this stage in the faith development, which struck a nerve for me, as I know it will with my listeners who may be recovering from religious trauma PTSD. Fowler states that, and I quote, "The dangers in this stage arise from the possible possession of the child's imagination by unrestrained images of terror and destructiveness, or from the witting and unwitting exploitation of her or his imagination in the reinforcement of taboos and moral or doctrinal expectations." Possession is a strong word. Fowler goes on, and I quote, "There are religious groups who subject intuitive projective children to the kind of preaching and teaching that vividly emphasizes the pervasiveness and power of the devil, the sinfulness of all people without Christ, and the hell of fiery torments that await the unrepentant. This kind of faith formation, and its equivalent in other religious traditions, can ensure a dramatic conversion experience by the time the child is 7 or 8. It runs the grave risk, however, of leading to precocious identity formation, in which the child at conversion takes on the adult faith identity called for by the religious group. This often results when the child is an adult in the emergence of a very rigid, brittle, and authoritarian personality." End quote. I can't help thinking about a video presented at a regional convention of Jehovah's Witnesses about 5 years ago, depicting worldly forces as masked soldiers fit with assault rifles, surrounding a defenseless group of Jehovah's Witnesses, adults and children, in the center of a field, who awaited obediently for the hand of Jehovah's salvation. This frightening scene was shown before an audience of families, some with children in the intuitive projective years, who no doubt also knew the stories of the destruction of the unrighteous in the flood, the later razing of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and hail, not to mention dozens of Bible stories of rape, war, and murder, some that were graphically represented in colorful books given to children to pacify them during longer sermons. I won't go on, but the naivete of parents who believed that they were safe to allow the Lord to mold their children in these formative years, and the religious leaders who ignorantly and arrogantly proliferated such material, has led to a generation of recoverers who now face the therapeutic challenge of parsing the traumatic emotional reactions associated with these imaginative stories of their youth from the realities of an adult social world. #religious trauma gang. Stage 2. Mythic literal faith, ages 7 to 12. This stage is identified by the narrative nature of the developing faith. In this stage, says Fowler, and I quote, "There is a more linear, narrative construction of coherence and meaning. Story becomes the major way of giving unity and value to experience," end quote. Interestingly, this is the first stage that Fowler identifies in which an individual can stagnate well into adulthood. Fowler includes some interview content in Stages of Faith to demonstrate this. Perhaps you too can think of some adults who can't seem to conceptualize their value system outside of just talking about their personal experiences and how they might compare or contrast to your own. Fowler says that individuals in this faith stage, and I quote, "do not step back from the flow of stories to formulate reflective conceptual meanings. For this stage, the meaning is both carried and trapped in the narrative," end quote. As an aside, Erik Erikson's approach to development across the lifespan suggests that individuals face crises, the resolution of which pushes them into a new lifespan phase. In the case of Stage 2 faith, Fowler states, the implicit clash or contradiction in stories that leads to reflection on meaning can lead an individual to Stage 3. Stage 3. Synthetic conventional faith. Fowler aligns this phase with psychosocial development that often occurs around the age of 12. At this time, the adolescent begins to form a worldview that is a synthesis of the other important figures in their life, be they parents, first friendships, or puppy-love relationships. Fowler states, and I quote, "In Stage 3, synthetic conventional faith, a person's experience of the world now extends beyond the family. A number of spheres demand attention: family, school or work, peers, street society and media, and perhaps religion. Faith must provide a coherent orientation in the midst of that more complex and diverse range of involvements," end quote. Referring back to his definition of faith, Fowler says that Stage 3 faith, and I quote, "structures the ultimate environment in interpersonal terms. Its images of unifying value and power derive from the extension of qualities experienced in personal relationships. It is a conformist stage, in the sense that it is acutely tuned to the expectations and judgments of significant others, and as yet does not have a sure enough grasp on its own identity and autonomous judgment to construct and maintain an independent perspective," end quote. The word conformist, of course, reminds me of my old religious environment. Emphasis was placed on unity of thought and doctrinal agreement to protect the cohesion of the brotherhood. The result, of course, is that, as Fowler's definition of Stage 3 implies, autonomous perspective building and moral judgment is almost completely disallowed. The expectations of others form the basis of spiritual authority in Stage 3. Fowler says that authority, and I quote, "resides in the interpersonally available they, or in the certified incumbents of leadership roles in institutions," end quote. I think back to many times when lay people in my religious community would approach me for instruction on how to handle all sorts of personal matters, from education, employment, relationship, and/or family advice. Authoritative expectations were freely given from local elders, the governing body, that is the spiritual leadership at headquarters, and written material published by the Watchtower Society. Beyond that, from the Bible, or from God. Regardless of the authority called upon, Fowler's point is that autonomous spiritual decisions are relegated to a body outside of the self. When it comes to personal identity development, Fowler states that during this stage, individuals develop the capacity for, and I quote, "forming a personal myth of one's own becoming in identity and faith, incorporating one's past and anticipated future into an image of the ultimate environment unified by characteristics of personality," end quote. That is to say that although autonomy is delegated to other parties and conformity may result, there's still a merging of this conformity with self-concept, such that a characteristic personality will develop, albeit not unique in relation to the rest of the community. This personality forms part of the ultimate environment of faith. Let's move on to Stage 4, individuative reflective faith. It's during this faith development phase that, as Fowler puts it, and I quote, "the late adolescent or adult must begin to take seriously the burden of responsibility for his or her own commitments, lifestyle, beliefs, and attitudes. The self, previously sustained in its identity and faith compositions by an interpersonal circle of significant others, now claims an identity no longer defined by the composite of one's roles or meanings to others." End quote. As a result, Fowler says, the person must face certain unavoidable tensions: individuality versus being defined by a group or group membership, subjectivity and the power of one's strongly felt but unexamined feelings versus objectivity and the requirement of critical reflection, self-fulfillment or self-actualization as a primary concern versus service to and being for others, the question of being committed to the relative versus struggle with the possibility of an absolute. End quote. Looking back, the onset of traumatic symptoms that I experienced when my faith system crumbled, that I discuss in my book A Voice from Inside, appear to fit within this stage 4 of Fowler's framework. The tension I experienced of separating my faith viewpoint from the community with which I had built my firmly held stage 3 faith and identity. Dangers exist here in the transition from stage 3 to stage 4 faith. Fowler says that there can be, and I quote, "an excessive confidence in the conscious mind and in critical thought, and a kind of second narcissism in which the now clearly bounded, reflective self over-assimilates reality and the perspective of others in its own worldview." End quote. Guilty. Let's move on. Stage 5. Conjunctive faith. Fowler states, and I quote, "Conjunctive faith involves the integration into self and outlook of much that was suppressed or unrecognized in the interest of stage 4's self-certainty and conscious, cognitive, and effective adaptation to reality." End quote. In this stage, there is a reframing and reworking of one's past, and an opening to the voices of one's deeper self. And this stage includes a recognition of the unconscious social myths associated with one's socioeconomic class or ethnic group. Fowler says this stage is uncommon before midlife. It is a faith stage that is, and I quote, "alive to paradox and the truth in apparent contradictions. The stage strives to unify opposites in mind and experience." End quote. This paradoxical understanding of truth can lead to either transcendence or cynical withdrawal. Fowler puts it this way, and I quote, "The new strength of this stage comes in the rise of the ironic imagination, a capacity to see and be in one's or one's group's most powerful meanings, while simultaneously recognizing that they are relative, partial, and inevitably distorting apprehensions of transcendent reality. Its danger lies in the direction of a paralyzing passivity or inaction, giving rise to complacency or cynical withdrawal due to its paradoxical understanding of truth." End quote. It's as if the individual graduates to the philosopher or mystic's vision of paradoxical truth in this stage of faith. The individual becomes ironic in that they see the truths that are accepted by their group, or by themselves personally, are not universal or impervious from contradiction. The challenge is then for the individual to aggregate their lived experience in the previous faith stages and this new paradoxical truth into an imagined faith system that is still operational in their group. This makes me think of the moderating effect of the paradoxes included in Eastern spirituality and philosophy that have been incorporated into some accepted psychotherapeutic modalities. I'm going to be doing a podcast on this based on Alan Watts's book, Psychotherapy, East and West. We also think of existential absurdity, the fluidity of the Tao Te Ching, and Kierkegaard's contrast with the ethical and ascetic. To the extent that these paradoxes are integrated into a system of values that, again, provide power, they can become a sort of faith system at Fowler's conjunctive level. Finally, we make it to the peak of Fowler's developmental faith perspective, the ever-elusive stage 6, universalizing faith. What spiritual seeker would not want to have the confidence that their faith had transcended that of their tribe, including the multitudinous perspectives of neighboring groups and peoples, and reached the heights of the likes of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mother Teresa? Fowler says that universalizing faith is just that. It has been through the crisis of conformity to a spiritual group, breaking from the group in stage 4, reintegrating an appreciation of paradoxical truth in stage 5, and now transcends to include value structures that not only embrace and absorb those of the community of man, but seek to improve them and move them towards spiritual liberation. Fowler cites from one of his earlier works, and I quote, "Stage 6 is exceedingly rare. The persons best described by it have generated faith compositions in which their felt sense of an ultimate environment is inclusive of all being. They have become incarnators and actualizers of the spirit of an inclusive and fulfilled human community. They're contagious in the sense that they create zones of liberation from the social, political, economic, and ideological shackles we place and endure on human futurity. Living with felt participation in a power that unifies and transforms the world. Universalizers are often experienced as subversive of the structures, including religious structures, by which we sustain our individual and corporate survival, security, and significance. Many persons in this stage die at the hands of those whom they hope to change. Universalizers are often more honored and revered after death than during their lives. The rare persons who may be described by this stage have a special grace that makes them seem more lucid, more simple, and yet somehow more fully human than the rest of us. Their community is universal in extent. Particularities are cherished because they are vessels of the universal, and thereby valuable, apart from any utilitarian considerations. Life is both loved and held too loosely. Such persons are ready for fellowship with persons at any of the other stages from any other faith tradition." End quote. The universalizers that come to mind are the ones who have become prominent leaders and therefore remembered by history. As was mentioned, this is because of the subversive nature of their visions. They also manifest what Fowler calls relevant irrelevance. That is to say that they commit themselves to a subversiveness that seems counter to what has been accepted as relevant by the societies that they are part of. The acts that they perform are often in the cause of universal justice and involve, and I quote, "the negation of one's personhood or identification with the negations experienced by others." End quote. Their faith system includes values that not only provide an ethical frame, but also action to improve humankind toward a spiritual vision of what mankind could be, a spiritual ideal. This is not activism for its own sake, or social disruption for irony's sake. This is the epitome of all faith traditions, a faith that is not bound by religion or even communal value systems. It expands upon accepted faith traditions in ways that offer a model that could easily be mapped to any system or group. I can't help but take a moment to self-reflect